Hello, everybody, and welcome to this second session of the ISTAT Learning Lab series. Today we have Bryson Monteleone in the studio, and he's going to talk about appraising aircraft in a challenging market. Bryson is a senior aviation finance advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Ireland, and he has over 20 years experience in aircraft financing, and he has focused mainly on valuations. Bryson is a ISTAT certified senior appraiser, and is currently the chairman of the ISTAT International Appraiser Program, as well as a member of the board of directors of ISTAT. So Bryson, over to you.
Thanks, Niels. Appreciate the introduction and hoping you are doing well. It's always good to see you. And thank you all for joining in on this. I know that we've got a good couple hundred people on this, and we're in trying times, but at least we can connect via video. And looking forward to any questions you might have as we go through this. Trying to keep this a bit interactive as much as possible to the fullest extent we can. We do have some polling questions. And we do, and you all can obviously ask Q&A as we go through this. So I will try to keep an eye on questions coming in that are relevant to the topic at hand and try to answer them as we go. Otherwise, I'm sure there'll be a little bit of a Q&A time at the end of the session. So let's just jump into it. I've been asked to do a presentation on appraising aircraft in a challenging market, and soon we'll be coming out with an article in the Jet Trader probably at the end of this month, if not sooner, regarding the trials and tribulations and the issues that appraisers face when looking at appraising aircraft in an environment like this. No doubt, we are in unprecedented times. So we'll walk through some of the issues and areas where we struggle with, honestly. We all work in a very industrious, dynamic market, but it is opaque. And it is, we miss sometimes, all data points are not available to everybody. So we have to interpolate. We have to look at areas of where raw data might come in and help us feed the narrative. So we've only got about 300 slides to go. Actually, no, just kidding. A handful of slides. But here's the outline. Let's take a look at historical precedent. Let's look at individual methodologies. And this is a fundamental key part of the ISTAT narrative, if you will, for appraising aircraft for certified appraisers. Definitions that are important to our being. We talk about this, we harp on these, but it's indeed very important to make sure that we're clear that we're all speaking the same language. And then a case-by-case basis. And then we're going to go through some takeaways. So let's go for the next slide. But in the meantime, before we jump into this, how is appraising like climbing a ladder? And when I was putting this together, I was looking at different ways of really putting something together that would make sense for everybody as we go through things that people don't understand, especially in a market that's challenging like this. So insert the obligatory step ladder joke. I thought it was kind of funny. But if we look at a ladder and how we look at different pieces of that ladder as we climb it, it starts to make sense of how appraising can come into play on this. And so how do we do this? There are a lot of fundamental ways how we can address looking at aircraft values, distilling the markets, and unpacking what it all means. Appraisers are in a very unique situation. We can't be, if we lag too far, we're not taking the market, we're not on top of the market enough, and if we're too far ahead, we're leading the market. Or we're seen as leading the market. But what we have to deal with in cases where there are limited kind of transactional data points, and a lot of people say, well, if there's no transactional data points, how are you appraising aircraft? Good question. So we receive raw data. What is that raw data? That raw data can be anything from lease rates, transactions, of course, historical and current, information on bankruptcies, announced retirements, lease returns, number of aircraft in the market, number of aircraft being stored, number of operators operating those aircraft, and order cancellations. So while it might not be empirical, the fact that we're seeing dollar for dollar transaction information, we do look at the raw data and say, okay, well, we know that this airline is going to be retiring these aircraft. We know what they're doing. We know these aircraft are coming out. We know this market was already soft to begin with, maybe had a bubble, and now we have to look at, well, what's going to happen now? So that raw data starts to kind of come into play and starts to create a story where, okay, well, let's take this one step further. Let's take it a residual value and look at the part out market. How does that part out market now, as it's changed, we know it, the end of lease, end of life construct that a lot of different stakeholders work within to make their business plans work, is now a little bit kind of unraveling, because airlines will look to themselves and start picking out aircraft they need for parts and the like. So what does that mean for residual value? What does that mean for strength in the secondary market? And what are we looking at when it comes to the availability of finance? So that is the raw data that we're looking at. Second to that is filtering. Okay, let's take this raw data and let's take it one step further. What makes sense? Where can we sift through the points that are important to us? How do we create an apples to apples comparison that makes sense for us? Let's look at lease terms. Let's look at return conditions, end of lease compensation. How much of our knowledge do we know based on the technical side of how much it costs to reconfigure an aircraft, the maintenance of an airframe, or an engine? So let's filter all these things and start to kind of put together what it means when we see aircraft trading. We know there's always a backstory. No two transactions are alike. It's never really an apples to apples. Maybe it's apples to pears. Maybe it's apples to bananas. But we're looking at fundamental areas where there's always a backstory. It's kind of like looking at the value of a lease. And you can tell the story of the lease by how much leverage the lessor had over the lessee, or the lessee had over the lessor. So what was the meaning that supported the construct of the lease? Who had more leverage? Who is getting more of the return compensation? What credit risk profile was put into place when we look at that lease? And so we start to pull this apart. So that's the filtering. What is the backstory? Okay, let's assign meaning to all this. Let's weigh the importance of the factors that we're looking at. We've filtered out, we've taken the raw data, we have all this stuff coming to us at multiple different angles of attack. We're looking at tons of bits and pieces of information, empirical, subjective, and otherwise. We're now trying to make sense of it. And now we're trying to assign meaning and making sure that really what is trying to kind of come through when it comes to looking at weighing the importance. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later on. But what is the data telling us? How does it fit within an appraiser's respective methodology? Every appraiser has their own methodology. They look things differently. Some will look at aircraft values from a different starting point. So when we start to assign meaning, when we start to weigh the factors, we have to weigh the relevance of how that comes into play. The assumptions are now where it starts to really build up, and we're saying, okay, we are now making assumptions. We're building in assumptions. We're making assumptions. And now we're kind of taking to task, okay, maybe the aircraft, let's look at the aircraft condition as an assumption. Was it half-life? Was it run out? Was it full life? Okay, let's start to really kind of unpack some of these items. And then from that, we start to make conclusions. How does that affect a base value or a market value? And again, we'll talk about this later in the slides, but these conclusions are fundamental to how we start to really put together that value. And then maybe we adjust our beliefs. Maybe we do nothing. Maybe the weight of importance of what we're seeing is, well, it's a blip and the market will recover and we don't have to go too far. Or we say there's a fundamental change and we have to start adjusting our beliefs and adjusting our reality and taking a look at the reality. And from that, we take action. And that's when we see appraisers come out with discounting values. But there's more to that story. So what we're going to go through today is a little bit of pulling apart where we see the fundamentals and why it's so important. Why does this all really matter? Well, it matters because we are well beyond previous events. This puts 9/11, it puts the global financial crisis, it puts the Gulf War, SARS, anything else really into perspective. This is something we've never modeled for. So what does that mean? Well, can this happen again? Is this the 100-year flood or is this the 1,000-year flood? Will this happen again? Could this happen again? Okay, well, if we model to that, then we'll never get anything done. So we have to learn our lessons. We have to take guidance from previous past cycles. And I say in here is that these are starting the discussions. We knew when this started to happen and we started to shut down networks and airlines started to ground fleets, what was going to happen. We learned our lessons from 9/11. We knew that in 9/11, fleets disappeared. What were flying on September 10th did not fly again on September 12th. Those were 727, 737-200s, older aircraft, DC-9s, that were still in use at that time that became irrelevant to a network. Airlines started to focus on the things they needed to, the more efficient aircraft, started to pull out and cull the herds on some of the older aircraft. So while these guardrails and the severity measures that we saw in previous downturns start the discussions, it won't necessarily be the definitive outcome. That definitive outcome is yet to be written. That narrative is still yet to come. We will look back and go, oh, well, that all made sense. But when we're in it, and we're all in it together, we can't ignore the market. We can't ignore what is happening in front of us. We can't just kind of put our head in the sand. As one of my close IBG members on the board and somebody you know very well uses the analogy, if you went into a coma on December 31st and woke up today and you saw all these things, you could not ignore the fact that the market is the world is a new place, and we can't ignore what the market has been telling us, and we can't ignore what the market is today. So no, we don't want to lead the market, but it would be egregious for us not to recognize what's happening. It would be egregious for us not to say that the factors that are out there today are really truly prevalent, and that are data points that we have to look at, and we have to make sure that stakeholders know that we have seen parts of this before, not seeing the whole thing in its entirety, because again, we are definitely beyond previous events, but we can't ignore what the market is telling us. So while we can't absolutely model to COVID-19 market, we must learn from what's going on. We must say, okay, this is how bad it can be. But remind you, like when we look at capital markets, when we look at rating agencies and what they've done in the past, and how they've looked at recessionary periods and troughs, and how they've removed cash flows from structures and from the vehicles that are being financed. We've never had the 100% removal, and we can't guide to that. But we can say, well, maybe there's a different way we have to approach this, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But what this really is, the takeaway, is that this will change everyone. Nobody should come out of this, appraiser, lessor, bank, OEM, with that unscathed. And I'm not saying that is to be damned, if you will, but you should look at this and say, what did we learn from this? How can we do this better? How are we prepared for something maybe not as drastic, but as something that we need to be making sure that we are putting the right precautions in place. So let's take a little polling question. Given the challenging market, should appraisers be providing valuation guidance to industry stakeholders? So I think right now, go on, and if you are listening intently on what I'm saying, share your opinion. So it looks like we are heading that kind of an overwhelming. And at some point, be curious to those that are saying, no, we shouldn't be. I think we're here to help the market. Again, we're all learning in a particular situation like this. It's always a new situation. So we are all learning this together. But it seems resoundingly that appraisers should be providing valuation guidance. And let's talk through that. So there we are. I had to, unfortunately, you guys can't keep on polling while I'm talking. Otherwise, I can sit here and watch this poll, and then we've wasted an hour of looking at this. But it seems like overwhelmingly yes. Well, I appreciate that. So what does that mean? So the historical precedent that we're looking with right now is that we are in extraordinary times. We've looked at guardrails of severity. These guardrails that we used in previous downturns provided some indices of percentage discounts, and we've taken those and said, okay, Maybe in some cases we were too harsh. And I'm not, again, the narrative again is not done. We don't know fully what's going to happen. We are looking at different constructs that happened this time with regards to airlines seeking bailouts and almost a global bailout. So did that provide a little bit of a respite when it comes to aircraft values? Maybe the severity wasn't as hard, or maybe it was too much. But we're looking at to say, hey, we knew what happened last time with aircraft that were removed from the system. We knew that older types got hit harder, and we learned some lessons with that. So here's where we're going to give. Now, this is not definitive; it's not penultimate. We are all in this together, but we all also have a right to kind of say, let's adjust the dial and see what's happening. I think there are, and we were going to talk about this, but it's easy to take broad brush strokes. In the beginning, you kind of have to. You kind of have to say, we know that old wide bodies will have a hard time. We know that old narrow bodies and some of the older aircraft that are facing maintenance events probably will be parked and retired and removed from the system forever. But it's the stuff in the middle. What does that mean for the rest? What does that mean for an 8-year-old A320, a 12-year-old A320, a 15-year-old A320, a 5-year-old 777-300ER, or a 3-year-old 787? What does that mean? And those are the questions we have to ask ourselves, and we have to kind of look inward and say, what is the market telling us? Well, we kind of are saying 787s, A350s seem to be popular. They make sense. Those are the aircraft that provide the most operational flexibility. Those are the aircraft that are being operated. 777-300ERs are being operated, but in what capacity? As a freighter, as a temporary freighter, or as passenger? The larger the aircraft, the harder to fill. So let's look at this. And what does that actually look like? What changes the construct? That construct becomes economic life. It wasn't only till about, say 5-6 years ago that we're having a discussion on economic life, when lessors are coming out trying to say, hey, economic life is longer than we think it is. While 12-year-old aircraft, 13-year-old aircraft were being torn apart for parts. And we're starting to look and say, is this really the new reality? Well, as much as we all like to have a positive curve going up and OEMs have their forecasts and everybody has their forecasts, there are divots along the way. There are peaks and troughs along the way. And there are unforeseen circumstances and unforeseen events that we didn't count on. We didn't expect OEMs not to be able to certify aircraft in this, with regards to the MAX. We didn't expect OEM issues when it came to production. We didn't expect a lot of things to come along that really started to push along where that secondary market. So the secondary market all of a sudden started to move to the right with regards to economic life. All of a sudden, aircraft are lasting longer. And so ask ourselves, well, what is that, airline ownership or is it lessor ownership? Is it investor ownership? Who owns the aircraft? And what is the construct, if it's on a lease, what is the monetary benefit at the end of lease for either renewing, recapitalizing that aircraft, or perhaps parting it out? Again, the exit strategies are so much more granular than they were before. In even 9/11, when we look at how the creativity of the end-of-life solution and how lessors and investors and owners can exit the residual exposure of an aircraft. Depreciation, that's a fundamental argument probably with among many as far as where these aircraft are, how they're depreciated, and the curves. And if the appraisal community, that depreciation curve is something that each appraiser opines on their own, based on their own methodologies, based on how they weigh criterion that are important to them. And whether we have permanent structural changes, whether those permanent structural changes are certain aircraft types, let's say 2 engines to 4 engines, wide bodies, large wide bodies, narrow bodies. So these are the things that it seems where we are making sure that we have to look at these fundamental aspects. And again, the story has not fully been written. So individual methodologies. Anybody who has come to an Appraising 101 session prior to a conference has decided to spend their Sunday with us and learn from the appraiser community. Thank you very much in advance. We know you could be playing tennis or golf or enjoying some sunshine, but you probably have seen a construct of this chart before. And these individual methodologies really take in weighing factors that start to shape how we look at constructing a value. And that in this case, let's take a look at how a base value might be constructed, and then that would lead to a market value. But if you look at these factors, aircraft ubiquity with regards to who owns it, how many aircraft are being operated, depreciation curve, again, that's part of the methodology, obsolescence of an aircraft type, whether it is now considered obsolete. But what happens if it's obsolete, but there's no other technological advancement that supersedes that? How many years the aircraft were in manufacture? Who's operating this aircraft? How large of an operator? What kind of operator? What is this tertiary value, which we say would be the lowest value of that asset while still in revenue service? What does the construct of orders and the backlogs and the deliveries, what is that telling us? And when we start to see all of that come together, let's overlay historical value. Let's take the data points we've had in the past from similar types and put that onto kind of a curve to see how these current aircraft types might react in the future or in the present. And of course, the economics, and that goes without saying that some aircraft are more economical than others, and some don't do as well. But maybe that's the aircraft type that has to be used in a certain situation, given a particular network or profile. So the key appraisal terms that support the construct of every appraisal is half-life. And that half-life is where we see you're right there in the middle. And why do we use half-life? Half-life is the apples to apples comparison. Now we recognize that half-life could be in some cases theoretical. Sometimes you're not going to get a half-life aircraft. You're going to get an aircraft that's fresh from an overhaul check, but half-life on the engines, or vice versa. So it's like a full life aircraft as well. That full life aircraft only really becomes full life if it's new. So you'll never get to the point where you have a full life aircraft that goes back to 100% unless somebody has overhauled or replaced every life limited component, replaced all the engine LLPs, and has done a full shop restoration performance visit and done all the maintenance checks. It doesn't seem that would be the most capital economically way of doing things, but so because the aircraft still flies, not being 100%, but maybe in some cases it does, and then we have to look at that way. But the real purpose of this is to say that half-life is our apples to apples comparison to make sure we have an even playing field. And otherwise, we have values all over the place. Your value guides that you get from the appraisers online or in print would be a nightmare because you have to make certain assumptions. And while online mechanisms and online tools allow you to make those assumptions, and those are built in as a mechanism or as an engine to support your analysis, that half-life construct kind of floats throughout a lot of our assumptions. Highest and best use and value in use. This all comes together with the key appraisal terms of the fundamentals that drive a lot of our background. A cost approach, the income approach, the value that is derived by that asset, and the market comparable approach. So these are tools that are in our toolbox that we can use when we look at appraising aircraft. And that has been, while most would say, well, we could just take a half-life value, but if this asset is subject to a lease, then maybe the income approach is more applicable. It is not as easily adjusted as before, in so much as there are different ways to look at things. And I think what the takeaway from this maybe is for the foreseeable future that we have to look at maybe a deeper dive on how we value the assets to make sure that we're actually getting the best, good or bad, on the value of the asset. So let's take a polling question. Niels, if you're there, while people are doing the poll, I'm trying to see some of the questions, but if you want to ask a question, feel free to ask me a question while we're waiting for some of the numbers to come in. Can't hear you. You're on mute.
Uh-oh.
Are you there? Okay, I think if you want to ask a question, otherwise we can go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to go forward, Niels, but on the if there's anything that you want to ask, let me know, and we can ask a question on the fly. Happy to keep this not just me talking, because I'm sure at the end you'll be tired of me hearing my voice as much as I'm tired of hearing my voice. So it looks like a lot of you understand the fact that base value is not the highest value. And that's kind of what we're going to walk through. Let's walk through some of this. So what is the fundamental definitions that we have to look at when we're appraising aircraft? And base value is the starting point. And it's the intrinsic value of the asset. So in some cases, it can be seen as theoretical. In some cases, it lines up with the market. The intent really is to have a value that starts from new and goes to tertiary economic value and depreciate to usually after 20 years, 15, 10, 50%, depending on the methodology. It never depreciates to zero. You'll never get a forecast value of an aircraft at zero, because that'd be kind of wacky if you were to back up and say, oh, well, after maybe 1 year prior, it's worth $25. We have to have the lowest point value of an asset while it's still in service. So that curve is the base value curve. So when we're looking at the relationship between market value and base value, we say, okay, well, market value is your spot value. That's going to be the value that goes above and below the base value, and is recognition of the market that we see right now. So let's go back and get in the rewind machine and think about where we were 3 or 4 months ago before all this started, and we had a fundamentally overheated market. We had a lot of aircraft that were above base value because we had a shortage of new aircraft coming out from the OEMs, and we had airlines just really needing to backfill a lot of their aircraft types. So it will be that need for those aircraft types became intrinsic to that kind of overall fever pitch in the market, and the market value for A319s, older A319s, older 737-700s, older A320s started to really peak. And there were times where I would be looking at an analysis of a portfolio, and I would see appraisers base value to market value relationship 50% above base value, because all of a sudden that appraiser believed that the intrinsic value of that asset was at X, but now it's X times. And you're looking at the fact that because of the need, highest and best use, and the value and use of that asset was so intrinsic and so high that the market value became very heavily weighted on the positive side. So what does that mean now? So we've gone from one side of the spectrum now to another side of the spectrum. And that side of the spectrum now is the fact that we have probably 15% of the world fleet in operation. And those aircraft that were receiving that high premium on the market to base value construct now are the other side of the coin. So when we hear stories of so-and-so appraiser discounting aircraft and it sounds dramatic, well, but we have to ask the question is, where did that appraiser start out from? What was their starting point? If their starting point was 55% premium to base value and they discounted 3% or 5%, or they don't, or you feel they're not discounting enough, where was their starting point to begin with? And this goes back to understanding the methodology of the appraiser and having a discussion with those appraisers as to what they're seeing in the market and why they are doing what they're doing with regards to kind of a look at the market and the discount of those values. Those values are not uniform. Not every aircraft type operates in tandem. Some operate a little bit, are more challenged than others. No surprise. Some of the larger wide-body aircraft, A380 aircraft, are more challenged. We knew that right off the bat. We knew that right off at the beginning, when A380s were parked almost en masse, that we had a problem. we knew the secondary market for that aircraft was limited to begin with, let alone now having aircraft that are parked, and in some cases parked permanently. So we have to look at that, and we have to say, well, what other aircraft type is in that class? How does the 747-8 figure into that? And then we start to creep on to maybe neighboring markets like the 777-300ER and say, well, this is the backbone wide-body aircraft of a lot of large networks for intercontinental flight paths and profile, but when can those aircraft be filled again? So again, the narrative has not been fully written. We are learning as we're going, but we can start to say that some aircraft we know will not be flying for a little bit of time. So when we look at the discount relationship between base value and market value, we start to kind of pull that apart. And that discussion needs to be had. That discussion needs to be had every time you look at values and see the delta between those two. And don't take it in out of context. Realize that there's a story being told by that appraiser. So it's easy to run and say, oh my God, so-and-so discounted the aircraft by 50%, or only 5%. Well, there's more to be told and more to be said. So let's go to the next slide. So how does that market value versus a lease encumbered value have that relationship? Again, the market value is a spot market value. The aircraft is naked. It's not encumbered. It is they value that asset in the given market without a lease encumbrance. Fair enough. But lease encumbrance is what drives a lot of our trading. A lease encumbrance is what drives our market. So how does that come into a valuation? Well, the constructs are pretty easy. I think we all know this. A rental rate, a discount rate, a residual value, and return conditions. So where does the appraiser come in? Well, the appraiser comes in either using implied discount rate or a rate supplied by the customer and the residual value. And that residual value can either be an assumption of half-life based on assumptions that are part of the engagement, or we start to look at the lease. What is the value of that aircraft? The technical value, the return conditions of that aircraft status at the end of lease. Let's not talk about end of lease compensation. Let's not talk about other monetary attributes, but the actual technical value of that aircraft. So we like to use full life sometimes in that. That gets thrown out a lot. That's a very rich discussion because of the fact that a full life, again, is usually, when it comes to the end of lease, unless there is a technical full life requirement, sometimes at the behest of a lessor or lessee relationship, the aircraft comes back in a full life technical status. That full life discussion becomes usually a technical value at end of lease plus some kind of end of lease compensation. And that sometimes gets confused because that valuation, that end of lease compensation, is outside the scope of the appraisal. It can be discussed, it can be modeled out, it can be added in as an assumption, but we're not going to say always dollar for dollar that end of lease compensation goes to the value of that aircraft, because the technical value of that aircraft is supposed to be a naked aircraft at end of lease, and that's what end forecasts out as such. So the fundamental definitions we continue is, okay, well, let's look at current value and then residual value. Okay, well, what's the big deal? This is a discussion that, again, confuses a lot of people because the current value and the residual value or the forecast value aren't always connected. And why is that? Well, it's a different kind of relationship. When we look at a current value, we say today, in 2020, the value, and you've all probably have seen this before. You look at the value guide of an appraiser and you say, the current value of this aircraft in 2020 is $10 million. Okay, fine. I'll take that for whatever it's worth. Sounds good to me. But the future base value in 2021 is $12.5 million. What? What does that mean? How is that possible? Well, the problem is that future value is predicated on the base value. And that base value, as we know, is the intrinsic value. So in some cases, appraisers are comfortable enough to give in maybe a short-term, near-term kind of future discussion. While future market value is on an ISTAT definition, it is a value that can be provided by an appraiser, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that future market value is not always a future forecasted 20-year value. So that 20-year forecast is not a future market value. It is predicated on the base value, on the intrinsic value of that asset. So when we're looking at that and we say, well, $10 million today sounds great, makes sense to me, but tomorrow $12.5 million is kind of wackadoo. And so we have to kind of pull that apart and understand the relationship between current market value and future base value and a residual value. And that is a discussion where you can have with your appraiser as to how they are unpacking themselves and what guidance they'd be able to provide to you on that. But if you look at any kind of valuation book or online mechanism or tool, it's going to kind of sometimes have that disconnect. Let's take the flip side. The flip side is a historical value, say 10 years ago, and then the value today. That current value today does not equal the future forecasted value of 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Why is that? Again, it's the same argument of you're taking an intrinsic value of an asset and then now comparing it to a spot market value. So we get asked a lot, well, what is your hit rate when it comes to how the values, how are you when you forecasted the values out 10 years ago, and how spot on were you when it came to the value today versus your forecast? It's not a fair comparison because they're two different values. And sometimes right on the money, but the future value that is the intrinsic value of the asset and should be looked at as kind of you can look at it and say, well, there's a cone of certainty that supports that value. And that, again, can be a discussion you can have with your appraiser. But the current value and the historical forecasted value are really two separate values. And we're not trying to hide behind, kind of smokescreen and obfuscation. It's just the way that the ISTAT value definitions are constructed, and that those are the value definitions that we have to adhere to. So what does that mean? It means that we have to take a look at where we are today on a case-by-case basis. Broad brush assumptions kind of were great to get us part of the way there. We could say wide body aircraft this, narrow body aircraft that, old aircraft versus new aircraft, run out aircraft versus full life aircraft. Fine. That gets you part of the way there. But if you really want to get into a proper analysis of how all this kind of comes about, you really have to start determining what is a core asset, we focus on the more popular aircraft can always tend to be 737 next gen, hopefully soon 737 Max, A320neos and CEOs. We know that those are the core aircraft to fleets around the world. And then we start to kind of push around the bubble, and we start to look at smaller narrow bodies, 737-700s, A319s, some of the E-jets and their capacity, and then of course the turboprops, and then of course on the wide body side we say, okay, A350, 787s, those look like core bets. For some airlines, they only have 777-300ERs and A380s. So what are they going to fly? They have to fly those aircraft. They have no choice. But they can't. Again, it's a case-by-case basis. How do we look at each aircraft? So the good example is when we're going through all this analysis on the ABS sector, and we go portfolio by portfolio, and we look at it and we say, well, what's the current status of the aircraft today? Let's take a pre-COVID value. Fine. We can look at a pre-COVID value. We can look at a COVID market value and say, well, this is what we believe the market is today. We know these are, okay, well, what about, hey guys, all the aircraft are parked. Yeah, good point. In the pre-COVID world, well, if we saw a bunch of aircraft parked, we'd start to clutch our pearls and say, well, these aircraft are getting parked. What's going on? Is there something here that we're not seeing? Yeah, well, right now, all the aircraft are parked, or mostly all the aircraft are parked. Okay, fine. So let's take that as a given. We know what's happening on the lease rental side. We know that 95 to 100% or close to 100% of lessees are asking for lease deferrals, forbearance, a reworking of the lease, extensions, you name it. A lot is fluid. So, okay, fine. Let's go forward. Well, what aircraft will come back? Okay, well, now some of these airlines are not here anymore, so that's a pretty binary discussion. Okay, well, there's no place for this aircraft to go back to because the airline doesn't exist. Well, that's a given. We can figure that out pretty quickly. Okay, we have an older aircraft, an older narrow-body aircraft. We're gonna take a punt on this and say, well, it's hitting up against a shop visit. It's hitting up against airframe maintenance. If you park it for 5 months, 8 months, name a number of months, the aircraft's going to have to go through maintenance. The airframe maintenance doesn't stop even if the aircraft's not being used. So we have to do airframe maintenance. The longer you park it, the more maintenance has to be done. Unfortunately, it's a fact of life, just like taxes and death. Airframe maintenance, the clock still carries on. Engine maintenance, not so much. If you're not running the engines, you're not burning up cycles, you're not burning up flight hours. It's a different story. You have a little more flexibility with that. But on the airframe, you have to take a look and say, well, do we have to now run this aircraft through a heavy check because it's been sitting here for a number of months and was already hitting up a heavy check anyway? So what do we have here? Well, let's look at the facts. We've got a bunch of money in maintenance reserves. The engines are okay. We can stub lease them out. Airframe, run out. The airline doesn't exist anymore. Well, I think you're kind of checking the boxes in the column that makes sense, which is let's retire the aircraft, scrap it out, and move on. That kind of discussion has to happen. And you have to look at the maintenance status. You have to review all these things. We can't look at an aircraft right now in this situation in isolation without taking apart the maintenance status. And what about end-of-life scenarios? We have to look at kind of where this all fits out. The MRO space is facing challenges when it comes to engine shop visits, airframe maintenance. And what we also know is that with all the abundance of parked aircraft right now, that you're looking at a handful of aircraft that are not being used. And the airline says, well, this is just, I've got tons of parts at my discretion and disposal. I've got engines I can take apart. I've got my own in-house MRO shop. We can recreate what we need and build up the network as we need to. It's not going to come back all at once. This is not like a 9/11 scenario where traffic was ceased for a couple of days and then the buildup was pretty rapid once people felt comfortable flying again. This is an emotional existence with people flying and networks rebuilding capacity on a very incremental basis. So they have at their disposal a lot of aircraft that they can pull engines from. And since they're in cost-saving mode right now, they will be reticent to send aircraft or engines to a shop visit if they don't need to. So we call it Franken aircraft. Franken engines, Franken aircraft. We can stub life engines out till what we need to get done. We can mix and match. We can move engines and aircraft. The larger airlines can do that. The smaller airlines, maybe not so much. So they will have to rely on something. But again, it's not like everything is coming back at once. So that's a owned aircraft situation. What about a leased aircraft? So let's kind of pull that part a little bit. We have a lease rate. It's a given. Great. We have a remaining lease term. We have return conditions. How those return conditions fare and can they be met vis-a-vis the status of the aircraft. End of lease compensation. Money is available to the lessor, usually as a lessee-to-lessor payment. Some airlines look at default penalties, and they're saying, hey, you know what? I don't care. I have to return the aircraft. I don't need it. I leased these aircraft 2 or 3 months ago. I made the unfortunate mistake of not knowing. Nobody knew what was going to happen this year, but we just leased aircraft at the end of November of 2019. I don't need this aircraft anymore. So what's the analysis that goes into those default penalties? What is the cost outlay that has to be assumed when it comes to returning the aircraft? Or to say, I'll call your bluff. Here are the keys. Come get it. See you. Or in this case, the airlines had the leverage. lessors don't want all their aircraft back. Lessors want aircraft stored or in use, parked and maintained and insured. So, and not all cases, some are willing to forego that given that maybe the relationship at hand. But if you're looking at whether you want to park the aircraft in front of your office in any given city, or do you want to say, okay, we can have it stored in a nice dry area, insured and maintained per the OEM? The option is mostly obvious. Okay, can you store it in North America? Because at least if you do not want the aircraft, I have an easy way. I can re-register it quickly. It's in a dry environment. I can control it. So these are the discussions on a case-by-case basis. But that goes back to, if we look at, again, portfolios and using the capital markets as an example, the arbitrage that can be taken. A lot of these portfolios, everyone is a little bit nervous about what's going to happen, but a lot of the aircraft in there are young. And when we say the young aircraft, we're saying what's going to happen. We kind of have a good guess. And this goes back to how we ascertain discounts and how we kind of start to try to kind of put the triangulation of data together on how we see values. How does this go into play when it comes to a discount? Am I going to penalize a 6-year-old A320 at the same amount that I'm going to penalize a 15-year-old A320? No. I believe that 6-year-old A320 will come back. I believe that aircraft has a future. So it's not always binary. It's not always black and white. But the discussion at hand is kind of, let's look at the arbitrage in some cases of what aircraft we know will come back. And they will come back. But again, that's above my pay grade as to when they come back. But we have to look at that analysis. And that's where the valuation comes in. Okay, we see a future. We see an intrinsic value. Most appraisers are kind of going back to that base value discussion. Most of those appraisers are not changing the base value. They're looking at the market value. And that is the spot market, and that reflects today. So that base value, look at the base value. Where is that intrinsic value when it comes to my asset? And say, okay, the appraisal community believes my asset has an intrinsic value of X. Let's take a long-term approach. Let's take a long-term approach when we do valuing and pricing out a lease construct, because ultimately you're taking that opinion of that long-term value out 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, and saying there's a fundamental intrinsic value of that asset going forward. Combine that with a cash flow and a discount rate, and then the kind of fluidity around lease return conditions. You can start to pair that out and see how it all comes together. So what are the key themes that we really have been pulling apart? And, I see some questions, so we can talk about them in a couple minutes. But the market will challenge everything we know to be true. We are, again, not going to come out of this unscathed, and we have to be looking at our own internal models, our own assumptions, and some models will be proven to be fine because they built in some of that sensitivity, and some models will be blown out of the water. We've been lucky in the last 4 or 5 years that our market has been on an uptick and that things have moved in our favor. But those of us who've now gone through 2 to 3 cycles have seen this show before. And we kind of can start to make assumptions about how we have to deal with things and how best to make that analysis. So how do we analyze aircraft in respective markets? Halflife has always been a go-to, but how do we sensitize that? How do we look at the value of those aircraft? Is it more of a value in use plus the residual, because so much depends on the tradability of that asset while it's encumbered by a lease? Do we still look at the construct of the intrinsic value of the asset? We have a very solid industry. The industry is going through challenges, but the asset class that supports it is mobile. It can be moved around. It is not real estate. We're not looking at buildings stuck in a city. Aircraft can be moved around. And that's what has made this market so much more challenging than the previous cycles, because after 9/11 or after a SARS, when it was more regional recessionary periods, we could take aircraft out of a hemisphere, a country, a region, and redeploy them because there was a need for that asset in a different area. Right now, there's no place to redeploy assets right now. So this is the worst case scenario. And again, we are going through this all together. How do we continue to use aircraft values? I think appraisers also need to kind of look inward and say, how do our models reflect, our methodologies reflect how our values are constructed? What guidance we can give without over penalizing a situation that we don't believe to be permanent, and that's core to kind of how we believe the market should react. And taking that and the fact that we overlay that we're working in an opaque market. We have limited data. This is not real estate. We don't see every transaction. Not every appraiser sees every transaction. So we have to take a look at this and say, we have to make some assumptions. We have to make assumptions from previous cycles, and we have to put guardrails in, and we have to recognize the fact that mutually there's fluidity to that. So it's an ongoing discussion. It's a dialogue with everybody, all stakeholders, as to next steps. But when we have to rely on historical precedent, and we have to say, here is what we're looking at as appraisers on the value of these aircraft, when maybe none of them are traded, then we have to start putting pieces together. And that's where we have to challenge our own models, and we have to challenge our assumptions, and we have to weigh the importance of what we're seeing. But when you have a whole fleet grounded, or you have a fleet retired, take from an airline, from a U.S. major, 757s, 767s, we can start to see some of these numbers come in, albeit based on subjective reasoning. We have many tools in our toolbox. Those tools are not just market value and a forecasted value. It's a value in use. It's a highest and best use. It's a market comparable. It's a cost replacement. So yes, it's great to go on to an appraiser's website and have a discussion with an appraiser and plug in a number. But there's so much that supports that number. And that's what I think we're trying to drive home right now, is that number is based on underlying assumptions and a methodology that's specific to that appraiser, and based on overlaid with the definitions that we talk about and we rely on to kind of go forward. So I think that is really the crux of it. Let's just see. I think we had one more polling question, and all of them, are of use, and we can watch the polling numbers come in. And Niels, if there are questions you want to ask, I do believe we have a couple more minutes left to go. And I agree. My life will be changed forever too. So what do we have on the questions, Niels?
All right, so we have a few questions. This is going to be interesting. I want to start with Paul Layton's question. He says there are over 100 A350 900s that are parked, but some appraisers out there say that market values haven't changed. Is that reasonable?
Well, I guess it also depends. I mean, it goes back to the starting point of where those values were. And I think it's a case-by-case basis. We've had the discussions with the OEMs, and they're like, well, hey, how can you be knocking down, discounting brand new aircraft? Well, the point is that the aircraft, if you have to move it from one operator to another, is going to face some kind of discount or a cost to reconfigure. So it really depends on the starting point of where those appraisers believe the values are. So it's a valid question, Paul. Appreciate it. But again, one appraiser's market value that they might or might not discount versus another appraiser's market value might be different, and how they kind of want to work within the guardrails of their own methodology. Worth a discussion, definitely.
Okay. Thanks. Janet Del Mel has asked this question. He says it's an easy one. At what point in time will the value of narrow-body aircraft go below 30% of where they were pre-COVID? When is that going to happen?
So, an aircraft values for a narrow-body aircraft go below 30% of.
I guess that is a pre-COVID value.
So taking a pre-COVID value and then discounting below 30% or above 30%?
Well, let's see.
Or below 30% of that value. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe
it wasn't that easy. Maybe I'm still on the...
Do both. Do 30%.
Do both.
And well, we just need data.
I think, yeah, it's, well, and again, it's a case.
Ooh, that was a hard question.
It depends on the narrow body aircraft. Obviously, we're looking at A319s and 737-700s. Those discounts will be a little bit higher than maybe the newer Neos, the newer COs, the newer 737-800s. But I think what's going to happen is that what's interesting, and this kind of unlocks a different kind of discussion, which is with all the aircraft starting to kind of be retired or converted to passenger. We see a lot now kind of coming out as a P2F situation. That everybody believes that that's the panacea, that P2F is the panacea for both 737-800s and 777-300ERs, which, and in some cases A330s, which is good. We want to elongate the life. But again, we're looking at with the narrow body assets, now you're culling the herd of aircraft. And if we have OEMs reducing their output going forward, we're going to see a tightening of that market again. I think it's inevitable. Not tomorrow, not next week, but at some point, because now the OEMs will have to play catch up with the demand. Eventually, that will come back. But I think that's probably not the answer to their question. So I apologize. Happy to refine that answer if a little more clarity on the question.
But do you think that the aircraft that will not be permanently retired, is there any reason to rethink the residual value assumption 8-10 years out from now? Bryson, can you hear me? Bryson, can you hear me?
I don't know what happened. Everything just kind of froze. So apologies if I'm missing. I think I'm back. So go for more questions, Niels. That's good.
Okay. You can hear me now, Bryson?
Yep.
Okay, good. So this is my own question, actually.
That's not fair.
Do you think that there is any reason to rethink residual values over the 8 to 10 year horizon for the aircraft that will not be permanently retired in this downturn?
So, I mean, as far as kind of readjusting, and I think in some cases, the residual values will have to be looked at because we're going to start to see a culling of the fleets. And we're going to start to see, it goes back to how we deal with base values. And the residual value, as we discussed earlier, is a construct of that base value. The residual value is the assumptions that support residual value are unique to each appraiser. But I think everything is on the table. And I'm not going to say everything's going to happen. I think everything needs to be looked at. I'm not saying that all appraisers should be doing any massive discounting or reworking. But there is a discussion to be had to make sure that we are reflecting what we believe the new market is, the new reality. Again, there's an intrinsic value to these assets going forward. I think we can all agree on that. Older assets, to your point, Niels, kind of on residual value, some of the older assets will have a different residual value, or at least will hit that kind of tertiary economic value sooner because they're now being seen as not as viable as, say, the newer aircraft. So there will be a relook, but I don't see it as a broad brush. I know people running for the hills. I'm not saying that a broad brush review or redo of residual values.
Okay. Now, so Shanit has come back just to clarify his question. And he says that we have seen historically that values went below 30% in previous crises. However, it was over a period of time. Bring that forward to today, and are we not at 30% stage yet? So when this time period, do you think values will go below 30% pre-COVID values in the next 6 months? In 1 year?
Again, I think it's going to go back to each market type. And I mean, it's going to be a case by case basis. I don't want to try to duck and block and tackle here on this, but it's going to be a case by case basis on how we see those discounts and we see that percentage because we're looking at a new reality. But some will be more than others, and possibly that going into that range.
Okay.
But that's just, but again, each appraiser's got their own methodology, so I'm not going to speak for everybody. I'm just going to speak for the macro.
Okay, so Patrick Brown has asked the following question. This is more of a technical question. Do you think that aircraft valuations will continue to change with DER PMA parts in them as OEMs strategically try to keep them out of the asset? Specifically, will the utilization of the asset be more important than the end-of-life part of that? Will leasing companies turn away from true engine at GE or no DER clauses in leases as costs become more important in relation to operating costs?
Wow, that's a weighted question. That's almost kind of for the leasing community. We have to make assumptions that the aircraft are airworthy, that are following OEM requirements. So if we start to pull apart those assumptions and we start to say that there's DER, PMA constructs in there, and this is a really good question, and I think we could do a full webinar on this, honestly. That we are then again, how do you value that? We know that lessors don't like that. We know that those terms are within the lease. But how does an appraiser go out there and say, well, does that cut the value of the aircraft by 10%, 30%, 50%? And I don't think we are the program, we are robust enough to say, well, that PMA is downstream from a fuel guide vane that could cause a massive catastrophic failure, etc. We don't see that granularity. We don't see that technical situation. So we have to make broad brush assumptions in our reports and say, right now, these aircraft don't have PMA in them. They're airworthy aircraft. They're being stored and maintained or being maintained by pursuant the OEM, MPD. And that's what we have to say because we don't have the visibility to that. But it's a good question. And I think it's going to, if you start to see that and we start to see PMAs in there, again, that puts a lot of weight on the appraiser community to say, well, what is that discount then vis-a-vis one aircraft to another, vis-a-vis a critical PMA part versus a non-critical PMA? I mean, what ends if you put a PMA part in a light, on a PSU? Does that affect the flight of the aircraft? No, but it has a PMA part. So then should I be discounting that? So it's a good question, but I think it kind of has to be beyond the scope of our appraisals at this juncture.
Okay. Aurelien Kaufmann is saying, hi, Bryson, with such a limited data set of non-distressed transactions since the COVID outbreak, don't you think the risk for appraisers to leave the market is higher than ever?
Good question. And we get this, and we understand that is a possibility. But I think it goes back to kind of the basis by which what we've seen. I mean, appraisers have been around for a long time, and we would be yelled at if we said nothing was happening, and we get yelled at if we're saying too much is happening. But we have to give some guidance using the guardrails of severity that we know that have happened from previous downturns. And that with fact that we know that we've exceeded those guardrails, we know that we are well beyond previous cycles or challenging cycles. We have to say, we know that we believe that certain discounts will happen. And IBA came out today and said, every aircraft's affected. So whether it be a 2% discount, a 5% discount, a 20% discount, that's up for them to decide. But to say that there are, and it kind of goes back to Paul Layton's question about the A350s. I mean, it depends on your starting point, and kind of the guidance behind that. I mean, I get questions from investors saying, well, hey, this airline wants to do a sale-leaseback transaction. Where's the COVID discount? Okay, Paul, A350. It's a brand new aircraft. The question is, what are the terms that support that now? Maybe the airline can't go back and say, we expect to have this much money because we want an equity check on day one. They have to come off that and say, well, what do you want? Do you want lower lease rate factor, or do you want more money in the bank and recognize that the lease rate is going to be commensurate to that schedule? So a lot of this is a push and pull. A lot of this is a push and pull on, and we have known this. We know that sale leasebacks, while are data points we can look at, are not always the penultimate way to look at values of aircraft, because within that lease is a lease rate factor that is commensurate to the negotiation and leverage of the terms of the two parties. And it also includes other remedies and security profile of deposits, reserves, and lease compensation, return conditions. So that pricing is, oh my God, so-and-so got a lease rate factor of 0.55. Right, but there are other remedies to that. And so I think this is where we have to start looking at how we approach the valuation side. Does a sale leaseback for a brand new aircraft deserve a discount? Well, it depends on where, the expectations of the airline. And it also, we look at the market as a whole. Is there bank financing? What's the loan to value? I guess to the question, and the answer is that nothing is in isolation these days. And we have to look at a bigger picture and recognize how these values, fit into a larger puzzle.
Bryson, Michael Weiss is asking, what is your view on the values for A380s? Clearly, the market value is going to be hit, but by how much? Will they ever recover? If not, will the base value?
That's a loaded question. That's not, good question. Obviously, very pertinent to the market right now. The value for the A380 is tough. I mean, this is something that, again, where are the tools in the toolbox to use? Value and use. Is there a value to that lease? Is there a value to the lease, the cash flows that support that lease? And is there a residual? Okay, well, let's do the things I can control. I can't control the lease rate. Going to let's say using a value and use construct. I can control the discount rate. What's my residual? Well, my residual, to your point, Niels, on your question is, what's my residual on A380s going forward? It's not going to be much. So then, does that ultimately affect the value of the asset? Okay, let's look at the market value. Yeah, the market value of the asset is severely impaired. We're not seeing trades. Okay, well, to the points that have been raised before, does that mean there's no? Do we view that the value of the A380, because we haven't seen trades of this asset, are at 100%? So let's toss that back. Is there no discount on the A380? And not to pick on the A380. It's a niche aircraft with a very niche operator base and a very limited secondary market. These are things we have to look at when we're looking at that. So I'm not going to say give exact quantifiables, but it's there's a severe discount, and every appraiser will have their own methodology to support that discount. And it goes right to the residual when it comes to looking at value and use.
Thomas Caulfield has asked, should the lifespan of aircraft be reviewed? It looks like too much capacity on the transition maintenance cost was prohibitive for certain aircraft, even before COVID, for example, on the 777.
Well, that's a good question. And this is something that we look at and we say, okay, well, the technical life, aircraft can last forever. I mean, we know that freighter aircraft are, especially 777 freighters, probably a long time, 30 years, because there's no replacement of the aircraft. As long as it's being maintained and the engines are being overhauled, they're aircraft that can last for a very long time. There are still, DC-7s and DC-3s in use in far reaches of the planet. Again, not much liquidity in those, but let's look at the technical life versus the economic life. And let's pull that apart, because for an airline, look at United Airlines. United Airlines operates a fleet of 777-200As. The aircraft fly just fine across the Atlantic. They've overhauled those things multiple times, and they work well for them. And those aircraft are beyond 20 years right now. So fine, okay. An airline will look at the life of an aircraft differently than a lessor. A lessor will say, well, do I take an aircraft and recapitalize it? Do I take the reserves I have now or end of lease compensation? Do I believe there's a secondary market for that aircraft if I spend all that money I have in cash and put that out to the market again for lease? And that goes back to a value and use narrative. And that goes back to understanding kind of the view the lessor has of that market. We recognized 5 years ago that construct wasn't there. That second, maybe third lease wasn't there. There was cash on hand. The part out market supported a part out because some of the aircraft were so new. They had maintenance reserves on account. You add the numbers and it comes down to economics.
Bryson, one last question. So I'm an investor and I am the lucky owner of a recent A350-900. And my airline that I leased it to has rejected the aircraft in bankruptcy and it's now stored in Iran. I want to try to see what my net worth is right now. And I go to you and you say, I'm assuming the highest and best use of this aircraft, but I turn around and I can't find a single airline who is willing to lease this aircraft to buy. So doesn't this whole concept of highest and best use almost collapse in times like these?
Not necessarily. I mean, again, if the highest and best use, say the highest and best use is to part out the aircraft. I mean, there is a value. And I think it also goes into the assumptions that support that value. If you're looking for your net worth and you say, well, I need to know the value of my asset now. And you say, are you assuming that you need to sell the aircraft tomorrow? Do you sell the aircraft in 6 months? There's liquidity there. There's a value for everything. It's at what price and what value. So I'd go back and say, well, if you need to sell the aircraft tomorrow, the value of the aircraft is a lot less than it would be in 6 months and in a year and in 10 years. Now, is there a lease stream to support that? Not today, not tomorrow, but we can assume that this aircraft, and we have to assume that there's an intrinsic value that's supported by the aircraft being in use, and whether it just be an airline buys it, hence a value, or there is a lease stream. But again, it goes back to the premise of the presentation, which is we have to evaluate our assumptions that guide our decisions and how we put values together. And if it's a cost replacement, an income, or a market comparable, those are different tools that we all have in our toolbox as appraisers to help kind of unpack that question. It's not as black and white as it was before.
All right, Bryson, thank you very, very much. And next session we have is on the 14th of July, and I'm going to do a little session on the aircraft value cycle and the pathology of aviation during this pandemic. So I hope to see you all on the 14th of July. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Niels, and thank you to everybody.